Welcome to Game Data. This week is part 2 of our look at the MacBook Pro with M1 Pro. This thing. If you haven't watched the previous video, stop what you're doing right now, go back and watch that. But for a recap, the main takeaway is that this computer is fantastic for basic uses, like light illustration work, browsing the web, or writing YouTube scripts. Mostly due to phenomenal battery life and a tendency to run cool until pushed really hard. But let's be real here. That describes a ton of machines out there, and heck, go buy a Chromebook or an M1 MacBook Air if you need something lightweight for super basic tasks. Seriously, the $2,700 spent on this is pretty much wasted if you don't need to use it for heavy-duty tasks. If you're like me though, heavy duty is the daily workload, and you do need a capable machine that can handle the likes of training XG boosted models, rendering 20+ minute videos, or recording gameplay footage. For us sorts of people, the question left to answer about this computer is whether it can handle whatever we need it to handle. And it's a bit complicated. Now, before we get started, it's worth noting that I have the base model and will have different struggles than the most powerful M1 Max devices. But we'll get to all of that toward the end when we look a bit deeper into the machine's various price points. Okay, with that out of the way, let's get started. To start off, let's consider some basic factors that are more essential for pro users. As I said in my previous video, the physical hardware of this machine is pretty damn impressive. The keyboard feels nice, the mini LED screen is perfect for editing, and the huge trackpad is one of the best you'll find on the market. Relying on the webcam for anything more than video calls would be a mistake, but the microphones are very competent, whether you want to record voice or instruments. That's a great baseline for a laptop to be at. After all, if the hardware feels bad to use, it'd be a hard sell even if the raw performance were amazing. It also helps me overlook some of the macOS's problems. Quirks. I could probably talk for this whole video on all of my mixed feelings about macOS, but that's a bit off topic. Specific to this machine, the biggest quirk to worry about is whether the app you want to use is available for macOS, and whether that app's been optimized for Apple Silicon. The Rosetta compatibility layer does an amazing job translating x86 software to run on this ARM machine. However, it comes with a slight performance penalty. That might not be noticeable on simple applications like OneDrive, but it might result in some decreased performance for more intense apps like RPCS3. From my experience, most of my core apps are optimized for Apple Silicon, or at least have a beta version available for use. While unoptimized apps still run well enough, there's a noticeable performance increase when their optimized versions finally arrive. After Effects is probably the biggest example that I've noticed. The current public version is still unoptimized. While usable for my basic animations, it tends to feel sluggish during playback and rendering. By comparison, the optimized beta version is much more responsive and tends to render much faster. Before getting one of these machines, I'd definitely recommend folks to do some research online for how well the apps core to their workflow behave on Apple Silicon. When an app is optimized, know that there are some areas where this machine punches well above its weight. To illustrate this, I've been using this machine for my typical data science projects as well as to edit the past few videos I've posted to this channel. In parallel, I've been running those same tasks on my desktop. While I do have a few other laptops lying around, my desktop's my main comparison simply because that's the other machine I really use for heavy-duty tasks. Given that laptop chips tend to be underpowered compared to those in desktops, before running everything, I figured my desktop would wipe the floor with this machine. It has twice the RAM, a full-size graphics card, and a newer, fairly performant Intel CPU. Yet, looking at the results, the comparison's not so one-sided. To start, I had two older data science projects that I figured might offer some decent stress tests for both machines. The first project centered around simulating playing the lottery. While slightly unoptimized, the simulation requires the computers to run through a crap ton of calculations to build a table of results. Across multiple runs, my desktop completed the script in an average of 27 minutes, which isn't terrible considering other results I've seen on other computers. Meanwhile, my MacBook completed the script in around 14 minutes. So yeah, this was the first sign that there might be some magic in this here system. But maybe that was a fluke, right? So for my second project, I had a script I used to explore stock market predictions using machine learning models. Now, for anyone who hasn't trained machine learning models before, they tend to be fairly resource intensive and take a while to run. To make things run a bit quicker, I changed the setting to make sure the script used 100% of the available CPU on both systems to train the model. Given that the desktop CPU has access to more cores, it should technically have an advantage here, yet both computers completed the script in approximately the same amount of time. Like, damn! As basic as these scripts are, they demonstrate that in raw CPU performance, the M1 Pro performs as well as, if not better than, my beefy desktop chip. All the while, it's consuming far less power and running much quieter. At peak load, the CPU does hit around 90 degrees Celsius, making the laptop feel a bit warm, but the fan is still barely audible, which is something I'd be unable to say about most laptops when they get hot. This boost of performance is also visible throughout the rest of the user experience. In general, the computer is snappy to use, even when under load. Apps like Photoshop and Illustrator are also incredibly smooth. While working on both new and old illustrations, I've yet to find anything that really causes this machine to stutter. Certain special media brushes and smoothing will still be accompanied by a processing delay, but that's not unexpected considering the processing behind those brushes. Another thing to note, just real quick, I plan to give some general performance estimates for Excel because it's actually pretty important in the world of data analytics. However, I recently found out that Excel for macOS lacks a ton of advanced features I'm used to on Windows, like Power Query or some VBA functionality. So basically, don't get this machine if you need Excel for anything that couldn't be done through a service like Google Sheets. So, cool. We have evidence that the M1 Pro CPU cores are more than competent. If I need to lean heavily on CPU-dependent processes, there's a definite argument for running to my laptop instead of my desktop. But what happens when we add the GPU to the mix? Well, that's where it gets a bit complicated. Now for that, we're looking first at video editing apps. Now, video editing apps tend to rely on solid CPU performance and thrive with solid GPU performance because, yeah, they need to be able to run both calculations for the various edits made to their timelines as well as dictate how pixels should be arranged on the screen for viewing. My video editing app of choice is Premiere Pro, mainly because it comes bundled with Photoshop and Illustrator, and it's felt more intuitive for me to use than other apps. On my desktop, I'm able to preview and edit videos in a project seamlessly. Half-resolution previews and no proxies needed. It just works well with few hiccups, unless I'm doing something heavy like adding warp stabilizers to a video. The same can't be said about my MacBook. As y'all might have noticed, my videos aren't too complex, yet any minor edit on a video clip results in sluggish playback, unless I'm willing to completely trash the preview resolution. I've been able to get around this issue by using proxies with my clips and manually rendering my timeline when needed. However, it was my first sign that the M1 Pro isn't necessarily a magic bullet that can be expected to handle all tasks with ease. The same goes for rendering. Comparing rendering times between my desktop and MacBook, results have been a bit mixed. At best, rendering to an H.264 format takes a similar amount of time. However, I found the desktop to be more reliable and slightly quicker on average. That's sort of expected though. As much as Apple wants to claim they have the most powerful GPUs, it's an uphill battle against Nvidia's much beefier desktop cards, especially since memory is a bit of a bottleneck for this base model. Heck, my RTX 3060 that I have in my desktop has about the same amount of DDR6 memory on board as this MacBook has total to dedicate to Premiere. That's not even including the 32 gigabytes of DDR4 RAM in my desktop for use with everything else. But hold on, all's not lost for MacBook fans. I specified H.264 formatted renders specifically because the times change if the format is switched to ProRes. You see, M1 chips have a dedicated ProRes encoder built in to help accelerate ProRes-based workflows. ProRes proxies render much faster on the MacBook than my desktop, and the same goes for outputting ProRes videos in general. If your workflow is ProRes heavy, this might be the killer feature for you. However, beyond proxies, I typically only output videos to MP4, so it doesn't mean a whole lot to me overall. Still, the fact that my desktop card isn't completely dominant here is a positive indicator for future MacBook performance. If the GPU is not quite as fantastic as the CPU when purposely used for intense tasks, you might imagine what gaming performance looks like on this machine, since more intense games tend to require sustained CPU and GPU utilization to play well and look good. To be told, it's even more complicated than video editing. While the M1 Pro might not have the most top-of-the-line GPU on the market, its performance in Premiere shows that it's at least usable for heavier situations. In fact, in games like Shadow of the Tomb Raider and Metro Exodus, this machine is more than ready to churn out 60 FPS at 1440p for medium to high settings. Both games are a bit older, but they also have a lot going on within them that can pose a challenge for less performant machines. Unless you're attempting to run something as heavy as Cyberpunk 2077 or attempting to push the graphic settings to the utmost limit, the M1 Pro should be more than suitable. However, there are a couple caveats to that point, since it's not always a given that you'll be able to run the game you want to run. Now, I touched upon this a bit in my first video, and I'm not going to beat a dead horse here. In general, a lack of proper 32-bit support and many games not being available for macOS means that the number of actually playable games is a fraction of those available for non-macOS machines. To emphasize this point, my current Steam library is around 120 games. Filtering for only games explicitly supported by macOS leaves fewer games than those currently supported through GeForce Now, which isn't the best sign if you're hoping to play a random game you find on Steam. It's technically possible to get around this with translation layers like Crossover, which are far from perfect in themselves. In-game performance is largely dependent upon the game being used and how well they mesh with the software. Crossover does claim some wide compatibility, though still not at the level of a dedicated Windows machine and potentially not for all the games you actually want to play. At the cost of $60 USD, it may also be more than some people are willing to pay for a potential slight compatibility boost. Slight is the key word here, since I couldn't get the games I wanted to play running at all, namely Control and Persona 4 Arena Ultimax. Even my DRM-free copy of Hollow Knight refused to run properly. Parallels is really the only other major option though. It allows you to run a Windows 11 virtual machine directly on your computer and, technically, allows you to run Windows-only software. But it costs $80 a year to actually use and still comes with its own share of hiccups. For example, while the Xbox app technically downloaded, it wouldn't let me play the Game Pass version of Sunset Overdrive. Additionally, while Persona 4 Arena Ultimax booted via Steam, it had severe coloration issues where whites were replaced with yellows. Control did play pretty flawlessly though. Set to high details, frame rates remained stable throughout my play session, except for a couple hiccups during intense gunfights. The occasional choppiness is understandable, since my trial version of Parallels could only utilize a fraction of the MacBook's total resources at once. Plus, there's a ton of overhead running any game through a virtual machine. The fact that the game ran as well as it did is a very good sign. Just know, if you're buying a 1TB MacBook like mine, that downloading Windows and the desired games could take a significant amount of your storage. I'd honestly recommend only going the Parallels route if you find it's the only thing that'll work for your specific need, and you've opted for extra storage space on your computer. All of this has been without talking about emulation though. As I mentioned in my previous video, it works well here for optimized apps, albeit without some newer emulators available due to limitations with macOS's awkward lack of support for Vulkan and OpenGL features. In Dolphin, I've seen a stable 60 FPS in Mario Kart Double Dash with up to 7x native resolution, and in Super Smash Bros. Brawl with up to 6x native resolution. PCSX 2 also plays Kingdom Hearts 2 at 60 frames per second, 6x resolution, so overall, a great experience. Notably, both emulators are optimized for Apple Silicon. However, unoptimized emulators like Citra or RPCS3 will still run perfectly fine via Rosetta. That's a real bright side in the rest of macOS's gaming woes, even if not enough to choose a MacBook over other performant machines. The last thing I wanted to mention in this video is the price. From my time with this device, it'd be hard to say it's not worth the $2,700 asking price. With insane battery life and performance rivaling my desktop computer, in some cases, I don't think anyone could reasonably say they wouldn't get their money's worth. But it's let down by the fact that $2,700 only gets 16 gigabytes of RAM and 1TB of storage. As magical as unified memory sounds through Apple's marketing, a shared pool of memory between system RAM and the GPU isn't necessarily perfect when there's so little of the resource to be shared. For the same price, you can get a number of other non-macOS laptops with decent CPUs, comparable GPUs, more storage, and a lot more RAM. Given their technical limitations, these beefier M1 laptops feel mostly fit for folks who absolutely need macOS, or who can afford to jump several rungs in the upgrade ladder. Also, if any of y'all want to buy this as a desktop replacement, or something you depend on for heavy work, you'll likely want to pay extra for 32 gigabytes of RAM, 2 terabytes of storage, and potentially the bottom tier M1 Max chip, at least, for an extra bump in performance. The extra RAM and GPU cores will be of real benefit for anyone editing videos or needing to work with very large datasets on this machine. Meanwhile, the 2 terabytes of storage makes Parallels a better proposition for covering any compatibility gaps. At that point, you've invested an extra $800 to $1,000, just under $4,000, in a laptop. For me, that's a pretty hard sell considering all the other options on the market, but if you really need a portable macOS device for work, it might be a justifiable business expense. To wrap things up, the MacBook Pro with M1 Pro is an incredibly premium machine. The physical hardware feels great to use and will do most people well when working on anything from browsing Twitter to editing videos. That premium feel is backed by a surprisingly performant CPU that rivals my desktop computer, and a GPU which is capable, but can't quite always keep up with the lower-end NVIDIA desktop card. If you need a device for things like graphic design, data analytics, and video editing, I think you'll love this machine if the price seems justifiable. I'd just recommend at least upgrading to 32 gigabytes of RAM if it'll be your primary work machine and you can fit in an extra $400 into your budget. Just don't buy this machine for gaming. Even if you're really interested in getting into the weeds with various potential workarounds, there are too many hoops to jump through. While technically viable as a mid-range gaming machine, especially for emulation, there are numerous compatibility issues which might lead to more frustration than fun. If you are interested in this machine for gaming for the sheer joy of tinkering, I'd say it might be worthwhile to wait until later in the year when Apple's expected to release their more powerful M2 chips for their cheaper machines. But all that aside, this has been a pretty long video, so thank you so much for sticking around for all of it. As always, remember to like this video if you did actually like it. It really does help. And click subscribe for more tech and gaming content in the future. Plus, if you have any questions about the M1 Pro that aren't already answered in this video or the previous video, or you want to share your own thoughts about the M1 MacBooks in general, just let me know down in the comments. I really do read all of the comments that come through and love to read all y'all's thoughts on each video. Of course, we do release new videos every 2 weeks, as always, and I think the Analog Pocket is actually on deck for our next video, which has me excited. I love that little device. But that's it for now. Until next time, catch you later.